June 3rd, 2022. In a quiet, upscale villa tucked away in the suburbs of Binh Duong, Vietnam, police responded to an anonymous call. What they discovered behind the grand wooden doors of the Lam family estate would haunt the entire neighborhood for years to come. The lifeless body of an elderly man was found in the study, his skull crushed by a blunt object, blood soaking the Persian rug beneath him. He was identified as Mr. Tu Lam, a respected businessman and the patriarch of one of the area's most prominent families. At first, authorities suspected a burglary gone wrong, but as investigators combed through the house, the evidence began to tell a different story. One not of theft or random violence, but of betrayal, obsession, and murder. And the most disturbing part? The prime suspect wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a thief or a desperate outsider. It was someone within the home, someone who shared meals with him, someone who once called him family. 26-year-old Nguyen Thi Thao, his own granddaughter-in-law, was about to become the center of one of the most scandalous murder cases in modern Vietnamese memory. As police peeled back the layers of this seemingly perfect household, a dark, unthinkable affair came to light. It wasn't just a crime, it was a collapse of everything that should have been sacred: trust, marriage, and blood ties. And what started as a desperate cry for love would unravel into a night of violence that no one could have seen coming. In today's episode, we dig into the chilling story of a forbidden relationship, a household built on lies, and a murder that shocked a nation. This is not just about infidelity. This is about power, manipulation, and the price of secrets that refuse to stay buried. At first glance, the Lam family seemed like the perfect household, a three-generation family living under one roof in a luxurious villa on the edge of Binh Duong. Mr. Tu Lam, the patriarch, was a retired real estate tycoon in his late 70s, well-respected, articulate, and always seen as the backbone of the family. His grandson Min was a rising tech consultant, freshly married to Nguyen Thi Thao, a 26-year-old former office worker with a soft smile and a reputation for being gentle and reserved. Together, they were the portrait of stability and tradition in a rapidly changing world. After their wedding in 2020, Thao moved in with Min's family, as is customary in many Vietnamese households. She shared the same roof not just with her husband, but with his mother, younger siblings, and of course, Mr. Tu Lam. Min, hardworking and ambitious, often left early in the morning and returned late at night, buried in deadlines and client meetings. That left Thao at home, where she gradually assumed the role of caretaker, assisting her mother-in-law in household chores, cooking meals, and especially taking care of the aging grandfather. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Mr. Lam had a fondness for tea, history books, and storytelling. Thao would often bring him tea in his study, sometimes staying to listen to his tales about the good old days of Saigon real estate, the rise and fall of fortune, and the value of loyalty in a cutthroat world. She admired his sharp mind and the way he carried himself. So different from Min, who was always tired, distracted, and barely present. What started as occasional conversations turned into daily chats. Daily chats became extended lunches, and eventually the lines between granddaughter-in-law and companion began to blur. What no one realized, not Min, not the rest of the family, was that behind those carved wooden doors of the study, a dangerous tension was building, a silent current that neither Thao nor Tu Lam had the courage or perhaps the desire to resist. To outsiders, the Lam household remained immaculate. Neighbors admired how well kept the property was. Friends often remarked on how lucky Thao was to have married into such a powerful, stable family. But behind the smiles, behind the polished teacups and pristine floors, a secret was blooming, one that would soon suffocate everyone it touched. By the spring of 2021, the dynamic between Thao and Mr. Tu Lam had changed. What used to be harmless conversation turned into glances that lingered too long, words that carried weight beneath the surface, and subtle gestures that, though small, spoke volumes. At first, Thao dismissed it all as her imagination. He was old, respected, a grandfather. But every day that Min stayed late at work, every dinner Thao and Mr. Lam shared in the quiet of the study, chipped away at that logic. Mr. Lamb, always composed, began to ask personal questions about her marriage, her loneliness, about how men seemed distracted, detached. He made comments, small ones, about how beautiful she looked in certain colors, how young women like her shouldn't be neglected. Thao would laugh it off nervously, but deep inside she felt something shift. Was it validation, attention, or something far more dangerous? She began to dress more carefully around the house. Not obviously, but enough that she noticed. A little more lipstick, a different scent, a tighter blouse. She told herself it was just about confidence, but it wasn't. It was about him, and he knew it. One rainy afternoon when the rest of the household was out, it happened. She brought Mr. Lamb his tea as usual. He thanked her, as always. But when she turned to leave, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers, then holding it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them roared louder than words, and Thao didn't pull away. What followed was a spiral. They crossed a line that should have never even existed, a line etched in blood and generations, now shattered in seconds. Thao was overwhelmed with guilt, but also with an unspoken thrill. Someone saw her, not as a wife in a fading marriage, but as a woman, and that sense of being wanted was something men hadn't given her in a long time. Of course it couldn't last, not in secret, not in a house filled with people. But instead of pulling away, Mr. Lamb became bolder, more possessive. He began calling her into the study at odd hours, leaving subtle but unmistakable hints. When Thao hesitated, he reminded her he knew everything, every detail, and he had the power to ruin her if she ever turned away. Thao had gone from curiosity to complicity, and now she was caught, trapped in a nightmare she helped create, with no idea how deep the darkness would go. By mid-2021, what began as a forbidden attraction had transformed into something far more sinister. Thao, once merely complicit, was now cornered, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. Mr. Lam had grown addicted to their secret, but it wasn't about love, it was about power. And Thao, she was no longer a woman. She was an object, a possession he believed he had earned the right to control. He monitored her every move inside the house. If she laughed too long at dinner with men, Mr. Lamb would later ask coldly, "Was that for your husband, or were you pretending again?" If she spent too much time outside, he demanded to know where she'd been. And most disturbingly, he kept digital records, photos, clips, text messages, that served as constant reminders of her captivity. Whenever she tried to distance herself, Mr. Lamb would weaponize her fear. "You think men would forgive you?" he'd whisper. "You think anyone would believe you over me?" In his mind, he was protecting her, shielding her from a world that would never accept the truth. But in reality, he was strangling her spirit. Thao's mental health began to collapse. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Her smile faded. She avoided her husband, afraid her guilt would spill from her eyes. Men still buried in work chalked it up to stress. He never questioned why his wife seemed so hollow, so fragile, as if a part of her had gone missing. She tried to write a letter, once, confessing everything to men. But before she could finish, Mr. Lamb appeared behind her. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "We wouldn't want to break men's heart now, would we?" It was in that moment Thao realized she wasn't just being blackmailed, she was being owned. Her thoughts weren't hers. Her days weren't hers. Her body was not hers. Worse yet, Mr. Lamb had begun to talk about a future. Their future. Fantasies of moving away together, of raising the child. Yes, the child. Because by then, Thao had missed her period, and she knew with a sickening weight in her gut that the baby might not be Min's. But even in the depths of her fear, one thought remained clear. If she didn't break free, something worse was coming, something final, something fatal. By late 2021, the walls were closing in. Thao had reached her limit. The weight of what she was hiding, the sickness growing inside her, not just in her body, but in her soul, was unbearable. Every room in that house felt like a prison cell. Every glance from Mr. Lamb, every whisper of his twisted affection, was a reminder that she was no longer living her life. She was surviving it. The pregnancy changed everything. She hadn't told anyone. Not Min, not her family, not even Mr. Lamb. She couldn't. How could she explain a child whose paternity was uncertain? A child conceived under control, not love. At night, she'd press her hands to her stomach and cry silently, unsure whether she was mourning the life growing inside her or the woman she used to be. But Mr. Lamb wasn't oblivious. He noticed her fatigue, her sudden nausea, and it thrilled him. One evening, as she cleared the dinner table, he leaned in close and whispered, "Ours, isn't it?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. He took her silence as confirmation. From that day forward, his obsession deepened into delusion. He began planning, talking about buying a second home, moving away, raising their family. Thao was terrified. She had to get out. But how? If she ran, he'd release everything. Photos, messages, recordings. If she told Min, he might not believe her. And even if he did, what then? The shame, the collapse of the family, the humiliation. In Mr. Lamb's hands, she saw not just a man, but a ticking bomb, and she was tied to it. She tried subtle moves, began packing little bags, hid cash, made excuses to leave the house more often. But Mr. Lamb was always watching, always one step ahead. He started calling her when she was outside, showing up unannounced. He even began manipulating Min, planting seeds of suspicion. Thao seems distracted lately, don't you think? You should keep a closer eye on her. The pressure mounted. Her days became a tightrope walk over a pit of secrets. Every hour was borrowed time, every conversation, a test. And still, she couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, because no one would understand what it was like to be silenced by someone who pretends to love you, but really just wants to own you. By February 2022, Thao came to a conclusion. There were no easy ways out, no peaceful endings, only choices, devastating ones. She hadn't planned on committing a crime, but deep down, something in her had already begun to snap. It was June 2nd, 2022, a Thursday like any other, humid, quiet, ordinary. But inside the Lamb estate, something far from ordinary was brewing. Thao had spent the morning pacing back and forth in the kitchen, her palms sweaty, her thoughts racing. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. For days, she'd felt her world shrinking to a single point, and that point was him. That afternoon, Mr. Lamb called her to the study, as usual, but this time she came with a decision, not an escape plan, not a confession, a confrontation. He sat at his desk, calm, collected, the same smug confidence he always wore like a suit. "You're late," he said, sipping his tea. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared at him. Really stared. At the man who had turned her life into a living hell, who had taken what wasn't his and wrapped it in chains of guilt and silence. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't do this anymore." He laughed, not loud but sharp. "You don't get to walk away, Thao. You belong to me." Then came the threats, the usual ones, Min, the family, the child. But this time, something in Thao's mind cracked. All the months of fear, shame, and despair surged forward. And when she saw the heavy metal paperweight on his desk, something in her snapped. It wasn't premeditated, it wasn't even conscious. In a blur, she grabbed it and swung, once, twice, until silence returned. Just like that, it was over. Mr. Lamb's body slumped forward, a crimson pool spreading beneath him, his last breath still lingering in the stale air. Thao stood frozen, the weight still in her hand. For a moment, she couldn't comprehend what she had done, but there was no undoing it, no rewinding the moment. The nightmare was dead, but so was the man she had killed. The next morning, June 3rd, Min returned home early from a business trip. The house was unusually quiet. He called out for Thao, but she didn't answer. When he entered the bedroom, he found her sitting on the floor, pale, unblinking, her hands trembling. "He's gone," she whispered. "I killed him." At first, Min thought she was in shock, that she had lost her mind, but the truth was far worse than madness. Thao led him to the study where Mr. Lamb's body still sat, cold, lifeless, the room stained with blood and betrayal. Min dropped to his knees. He couldn't process what he was seeing, not just the death of his grandfather, but the death of everything he thought he knew. Police were called shortly after. A neighbor had already placed an anonymous tip the night before, reporting a loud argument and a thud. When authorities arrived, they found the crime scene exactly as Thao had left it. The paperweight, the blood, the silence. At first, they suspected a robbery, but with no signs of forced entry and Thao's quiet confession, the truth became clear quickly. She was arrested at the scene, cuffed in front of her husband, who could barely look at her. At the station, Thao gave a full statement. She didn't deny what she'd done, but when detectives asked why, her story unfolded like a horror novel, a forbidden affair, blackmail, manipulation, fear. The officers listened, not with disbelief, but with growing dread. Could it be true? Could the respected patriarch, Mr. Lamb, have been hiding such a grotesque secret? The investigation would have to dig deep, but already things weren't adding up. Surveillance footage, deleted texts, a pregnancy, a woman who had clearly been pushed too far. The media caught wind within days. Headlines screamed, "Wife kills grandfather-in-law in secret affair scandal." And the Lamb family name, once a symbol of respect and power, was now plastered across every screen in the country, stained with blood and disgrace. The trial began in November 2022, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters, neighbors, even strangers who had followed the story obsessively. Thao stood on the defendant's bench, wearing a plain blouse and no makeup, her hair tied back. She looked nothing like a murderer, and yet, here she was. The prosecution laid it out first. They painted Thao as manipulative, emotionally unstable, and dangerously impulsive. She knew what she was doing, they said. She made her choice and chose violence. They displayed the crime scene photos, the paperweight, the autopsy report. They played audio clips from her police confession. But they couldn't explain one thing: why someone like her, quiet, soft-spoken, well-educated, would commit such an act. That's where the defense stepped in, and what they revealed shook the room. They spoke of grooming, of control, of how Mr. Lamb had preyed on her loneliness and used his power and reputation to silence her. They presented deleted text messages recovered from Thao's phone, messages from Mr. Lamb threatening to expose everything if she left. They shared psychiatric evaluations detailing months of trauma, anxiety, and isolation. And when Thao took the stand, her voice breaking as she recounted what she'd endured, many in the room turned away, not in disbelief, but in heartbreak. The jury deliberated for days. They weighed her confession, the trauma, the murder, and in the end, they returned a verdict of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated, but committed under extreme emotional distress. Thao was sentenced to 18 years in prison, not the harshest sentence, but far from forgiveness. Min filed for divorce shortly after. The child, whose paternity would never be confirmed, was placed into state custody, and the Lamb family estate, once a symbol of wealth and legacy, was sold quietly, its gates locked forever to the public eye. In the months following the trial, the Lamb family estate remained locked behind iron gates, abandoned like a haunted relic of the past. The ornate halls, once filled with laughter and family meals, now stood cold and silent. The house hadn't just lost its patriarch, it had lost its soul. Min, heartbroken and humiliated, disappeared from the public eye. Friends said he moved abroad, changed his name, and never spoke of his past again. The child, a living reminder of the twisted secret, was placed in foster care, its origins too complicated for any simple resolution. Even state agencies debated whether the baby should be told the truth someday, or be allowed to live without ever knowing what led to their existence. Neighbors stopped talking. The name Lamb became taboo. Where once there was envy, now there was shame. And where there was once admiration, only whispers remained. How could something so monstrous happen in such a beautiful home? But the truth is, monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they wear suits. Sometimes they live in the room next door. Sometimes they smile at you over breakfast. As for Thao, she began serving her sentence in a women's correctional facility. Reports from inside say she's quiet, withdrawn, rarely speaking unless spoken to. She's refused interviews, declined visitation, and when asked if she regrets what she did, she reportedly replied only once, "I regret not leaving sooner." Was she a victim or a killer? A woman manipulated beyond her limit, or a wife who made the ultimate mistake? The answer, perhaps, isn't one or the other, but both. And that's what makes this case so haunting. Because beneath the headlines, beyond the scandal, lies a deeper tragedy. A woman who fell through the cracks, a family that ignored the signs, and a secret that was never supposed to exist in the first place. If this story disturbed you, it should. If it made you angry, even better, because it means you understand just how deep betrayal can run, how dangerous unchecked power can become, and how silence in a home, in a marriage, in a system can be just as lethal as a weapon. Too often, people suffer behind closed doors, convinced that no one will believe them, afraid of shame, of losing everything, and in that silence, monsters grow bolder. What happened to Thao is not an isolated case. Around the world, people, especially women, are manipulated, silenced, and controlled by those who hold power over them. Sometimes it's a boss, sometimes it's a teacher, and tragically, sometimes it's family. This isn't just a story about a forbidden affair. It's a warning about what happens when boundaries are crossed, when love turns into obsession, and when manipulation is mistaken for affection. If you or someone you know is being threatened, blackmailed, or emotionally trapped in any relationship, speak out. Seek help. There are resources, counselors, and communities ready to listen, because no one deserves to live in fear. No one deserves to feel alone inside their own home. And to our audience, what do you think? Was Thao justified? Was the verdict fair? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we uncover dark truths every week. This is more than storytelling. This is a mirror. And sometimes what it reflects isn't pretty. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and most of all, stay safe.